All right, I think we're heading into liveness. I'll just send out the old tweet. So my plan is that we should look at some of the work me and a few buddies have been doing on working our way towards an Elixir-based CMS. And that's, we're not nearly there, not at all, but we are trying to do it fairly bottoms up. A bottom-up approach. Bottoms up. Yeah, that's when you're drinking, right? So it's time-consuming, is what I'm saying. And I think it's the right thing to do because this type of work, so you can do a lot of, you can make a CMS and really, really screw up the details. And I don't want to do that because I've worked with bad. Yeah, I worked a lot with CMSs in my past, and they can certainly have a lot of issues. All right, let's take a look at what we have been doing. So when I'm saying building a CMS, I have some fairly particular ideas of what that should mean. Today, most CMSs are headless, as it's called, or support some kind of headless operations, which essentially means they aren't primarily or only used to make a website, but they might be the backend for an app, for example, or they might be the backend for many parts of a software system. And that's a very powerful approach. And if you are part of a more advanced software system than a typical website, it starts to place particular demands on you. Demands that, for example, WordPress has a hard time handling. It's incredibly complicated and hard to do proper DevOps on WordPress. Hold on, gotta rename the stream. Live stream. Elixir thoughts on CMS with code. So actually, let me look up. I have two sort of. So this post on the WordPress merging problem goes into how hard it is to do DevOps properly with WordPress. And this one covers a few of my other frustrations, more in the effectiveness thing. So one big deal is how you handle schemas. And if you want your users to be able to go into your CMS and create a content type from scratch, sort of, oh, I want to create the blog post, or I want to create the calendar event, or I want to create the concert event type, and add some fields to that, and then be able to pull it out via API, or render it as a web page, or whatever headless or headed operation you're going to be running in. That places a lot of demands on how dynamic your data store needs to be in handling that. And what typically WordPress and Drupal and these kinds of things do is that they have, I don't remember the three-letter or acronym for this type of pattern, but essentially they have sort of a core data type, and then any added fields are added as not as separate tables usually, and sort of tables describing fields rather than the field. So if you add an extra text field, if it needs to be, I think Drupal 7 actually shifted that, so that might be unfair to them. I think they actually build one table, and unless you're doing sort of multi-item, they actually stick it in the one table, which is okay. But essentially, sometimes they get really, really complicated about modeling fields, and it gets really inefficient. And the most effective way of modeling fields is if you can do it straight into sort of database tables. That's a fairly efficient way of modeling entities and fields. It's very straightforward. It's very expected. So that's sort of the approach we are looking at taking right now. And to avoid some of the serious problems, hey, need to sleep. To avoid some of the serious problems with the sort of DevOpsing of a CMS, you need to be able to do something decently smart, or at least handle whenever you're having changes to, for example, types in two different places. And in WordPress, there are so many problems related to this kind of merging, and that's something we would want to avoid. And avoiding many of these problems, usually the way I build software, whenever I have a wild idea and I want to push it, I go fairly top down. It's like, yeah, let's just build it and see what we get. But this is really something where you need to sit down, have a think, and figure out, okay, what's a tenable solution? It needs to be fairly bottoms up. And what we're leaning towards right now, I've also seen headless CMSs that do something similar to this, is that you essentially can't perform destructive operations on the schema. So any new fields you add have to be optional at the data layer, not necessarily in the UI layer, but at the data layer. And removing a field isn't actually removing the field. It needs to be archived, essentially, so that you don't get conflicts that are destructive and can cause data loss. So I've been working a little bit on something along these lines, and right now it's called ecto entity. That's not the name of what the CMS would be named in the end. That's the library that the CMS would need for data management. Let's see, I'll tmux it. So has a bit of a test suite. I should probably do something to suppress those debug messages. They're a recent addition. So what I have been doing on this, nothing there, right? So the creation of the type, that's probably one of the first. They have a whole doc on sort of my intended design for this, and some people have seen it, some people haven't. I've shared it with my newsletter at least. So this is an example of how it can be used. So if you want to create a type, you can pass it you can use type new, activeentity.type is aliased. Type.new, and then you pass it posts, so the table name, the nice and fancy schema style name, post, the singular of the word, post, and the plural of the word, posts. That's mostly for allowing a UI to display these usefully later. And then you can do, I want some migration defaults, please. So give me a migration set with the defaults in it. So the defaults, hey McBull, so the defaults include an ID inserted at and updated at. So, and then we go, yeah, we want to add a field. So inside this migration set, and then we get, and so we add a field called title, and it's a string, and it's nullable false. And what do we get? Yeah, so we get something that matches this. It has a source called posts, so that's the table name. It has a label, it has a singular, it has a plural, and then it has some fields. It also has a lot of other stuff. So actually, let's take a look at that. Yeah, I have some warning I should probably clean up. So let's actually reproduce that. That thing. D equals posts pipe type.new post post posts. We don't have to put it in T, we'll just get it. So that's the first part. So now we have that in V. And if we want to, so you can see that it has an empty list called migrations. Because whenever you want to change the database to match the shape of a schema, so then you need to run migrations to move it to that point. And that's sort of where you can run into trouble with deployments and stuff. And where it can get really, really tricky if you have two WordPress databases that are out of phase with each other when it comes to what the schemas are and stuff. And a lot of the basic design of WordPress doesn't really allow them to fix that in a good way, I don't think. So, but let's keep going with this. So we take type.migration defaults, pass it our previous result, and set. Oh, sorry. And then we do set. Oh, we can do type.add field to our set. We want it to be a title. We want it to be a string. We want it to be a string. One of these could arguably be a text, but yeah. And it's not going to be nullable. Okay. That's something. And then we want to end that call. Ooh, function defaults. Oh yeah, migration defaults. That's a explodey one. So let's do that. And there we go. So what did this add to our, so this is V. What if we do v.migrations? Actually, I should do, what do I have in V6? That's the one. So T equals V6. Now I have the type available to me and I can do T.migrations. So this is a migration set. This is one set of changes to the type. And it's nice to be able to group changes so you don't get a lot of small ones when it's not necessary. And it also potentially allows some optimization. So we can see it has an ID, it has a last migration count. Some of that stuff is still in flux. We'll see. The guy who's primarily working on using the migrations to actually generate database alterations is still working on it. So, but the set is a list of operations. So we have the type, add primary key, and the primary type is UUID. So it's not a normal string ID by default, it's a UUID. You can use string IDs, but this is also a migration thing. If you've created some content on a developer's machine, which is very common when you're dealing with WordPress, and you've created some content in production, and they are both of the same type, or they share the VP posts table, and they both have incrementing IDs, probably you should just copy paste that content over, even if it's a pain in the neck, because you'll never make it work. So a lot of deploying new WordPress updates tends to end up being repeat a lot of steps. And if you do UUIDs, you can actually do some of that a little bit more intelligently, just because you don't get key collisions in nearly the same manner. Okay, second operation here, this one, that's type add timestamps. So it adds updated at and inserted at. So that's a default sort of convenient shortcut. And then there's the type add field. It's a field type string. No filters, no meta. It has an identifier, that's title. It has a storage type, string. So field type maps to the ecto type, and storage type maps to the ecto database type or database type. Validation options required false. Could possibly have passed true there, that would have been good. So that's the default. Persistence options here. Indexed is false by default. Nullable is false because we said it should be. And meta is used for, well, that would be used for sort of UI things like, oh, but this particular string field is supposed to be a file uploader. So we should use the file upload widget, or it should be in this group of fields visually, or it has this ordering or whatever. So if you need that kind of information about your fields, the meta provides it. So this is just the data structure. It does not do anything. I've tried to build a decent type for it. And these are atom keys that are acceptable to turn from strings to atoms. This is also something that we ran into doing this particularly in Elixir. So ecto is trying to be very smart at compile time, which is probably for the best. It's just not the best for my use case. Not for this use case. So, because if I wanted to build a service using this CMS, I would want it to be possible for the user to create types at runtime. That's been one of my criteria early on, and some people have helpfully pushed back on that, and I'm still pretty keen. That's pretty much still where I'm at. And if you want to expose that possibility, you can't really sort of generate normal ecto schemas and work with those, because those require at different stages and in different ways, a few different ways, they require atoms. And if you turn a bunch of strings into atoms, that provides the power for your users to just bring down the whole virtual machine and just overflow the Atom table. It's very possible to protect against that with some decent heuristics, like, oh, but you can't create more than this, and you can't have more fields than that. But I don't really want to do that kind of bookkeeping. It doesn't feel like a sound design. It doesn't feel healthy to me. So we're doing things the hard way. But first, we created this data structure. So this is a bunch of type annotations for this whole data structure, and I might restructure this at some point because it's a little bit messy. I also investigated bringing in norm, and I still want to do something like that for validating. And the tricky part is I want a type annotation, I want a norm, so a norm contract. And for some things, I would also want some change sets to actually provide validation error messages and that kind of thing. And I don't find it feasible to just define all three of those. That seems like a pain in the neck, so I haven't focused on that. But this module, Ecto Entity Type, it essentially just deals with a bunch of data. So it can create a new one. It can create the struct type from a map, which is nice to have. And it can turn it to a persistable, and it can turn it from a persistable. So these persistables is meant to be, so that's the entry point and exit for saving and loading these from any kind of data store. They essentially turn them into non-typed maps and make everything friendlier for persisting. And that comes in more importantly when we look at the store. So there's a migration default, there's a migration set. So this is the sort of API for adding things. So you can add primary key, you can add field, you can add timestamps, and it behaves a little bit differently if you've started what's called a migration set, so grouping migrations, or if you're just running a single one. Both are quite possible. And there's also alter field, which allows you to change an already existing field in some ways. This is actually slightly interesting. So the persistence options when you create a field are quite flexible. It's like you can set the nullability of something and such. But when you're changing a field, you can make it nullable, but you can't make it required non-nullable. You can add an index and you can drop an index. We want to support both of those. You can remove the uniqueness, but you can't add it. And you can set a default. Well, you can change essentially change any validation option, because those are in the application layer and are not as sensitive. So this is a whole bunch of stuff related to the internals. So much fun. Some of this I would really like to make cleaner, but it's okay. So let's look at the store. I haven't added good examples for using the store here. So let's see, we can probably look at the tests for the best examples. So this is a typical case where I build a lot of tests, or a fair number of tests at least. Hey Andre, I do not have a .files repo anywhere. I was going to say, and my setup isn't very carefully tuned. and it's not. I did get some help from a Vim friend setting some of it up, and then I did recently do a few adjustments. So it's definitely not stock, but it's also not very fancy. But let me know if you have any specific questions. I wouldn't mind sharing my Vim file, but I haven't. I just haven't. So the storage test. So there's a few. No? Oh, right. This implements a storage behavior, the storage behavior inside this test, because we want a test storage that is very ephemeral and easy to remove and clean up, and it sort of tests the contract as well. Okay, so we create some config. We have a fake SQL test repo, super useful. Ripped it straight out of Ecto or out of Ecto SQL. And we have some stuff for creating a new type and for stripping ephemeral data, but let's see. So we want to init a store. Store.init. Okay, what's a config? So it has one definition for where do we want to store our types? What module is responsible for that, and what settings do we want to send to it? And then we have what repo are we using for the actual data? And is that a mod? Give us a module name for that. And if it is dynamic, provide a PID. So dynamic is when you're doing multi-tenancy, for example. Very important for this type of system. So if you're curious about what kind of product would use that and use this, I mean, the end goal is for it to be a useful CMS in general, but you should be able to build something like Contentful on top of it. And that means handling multi-tenancy and that kind of thing. So if you want to store your type information in the database, you certainly can. It's a very small module to implement a storage backend. We can look at that. It was, I think it's like 4 functions: get type, put type, remove type, list types. And here, this test one uses the process dictionary because that's super convenient. But yeah, this is just the search that the config is set to what we expect. So what happens if we try to get a type that's missing? No. Okay, so here we create a new type, similarly to what we did over in this terminal just now. And then we put that type in the store, and then we get it from the store. And we strip the ephemerals in the comparison. So ephemerals are an interesting thing. Let's actually see if we can demystify those a bit. So I really want this to have a nice to use API for when you're working with these types. And maybe I'm adding too much magic. I'm not sure. You tell me. So the struct here has an ephemeral key. Ephemeral stuff is additional context that this thing should have, but that will not be saved. So it will not be persisted when you put the type, but when you're loading the type from a store, the store already has the config info for what repository is this and what type store is this. So that information is snuck into the type ephemerals when you load it, which means that you can later use that information when you're making making queries, so actually creating and removing data. So this uses the simple JSON store, which is something I implemented in the library. So this will actually write store types as JSON on your file system. It uses the tempdir tag, which is super convenient. That's an XUnit thing. But let's actually look at something that makes some queries. So down here, we make it set up a store. We create a new type. We put the type, which means we now have store ephemerals. So now the type is fully charged. And if we want to insert a new instance of that type, so if the type is post, this is a post. Store, then the API is store, insert, type, title, body. And right now, this would not do a whole bunch of validation. There's a lot of potential for adding validation, but we don't do a lot of it right now. And because we're using the very fake SQL backend for tests, I've made it send me a message with the query and the params, so I can compare it, make sure that we generate the correct queries with the correct characters and the correct, what are those called? Placeholders, values, yeah, parameters, yeah, parameters. And here we can create it with bad source, and it will strip out a bunch of bad characters from some of the things that aren't parameterized. I don't know if you can parameterize these things. I don't think so. All right, and similarly with fields. So, and then, yeah, we have insert, we have list, we have update, we have delete. Those all exist. And more recently, I added this, which is a test where we don't use the fake SQL, we use Sqlite. So this, since we don't have migrations implemented yet, this creates the table that we would expect to be the result of the migrations. So it's a little bit of a, this is a workaround until that's in place. Uses the simple JSON store, uses this in module repo. So this little bootstrap function will create the repo, create the table, set up a config, create a new type, init the store, put the type. Now we have a fully ephemeralized type, and we can do a store insert, and then we can do a store list. So I would actually like to implement more of these things, just to get update and delete in there as well. So we should be able to do, well, first we do need to insert it. And I guess the insert does not necessarily mean it's enriched with the information we expect. So, or rather, we're not necessarily aware of the ID of that post yet. Actually, that's a good point. Insert should probably return that. What does it currently return? It returns with index numeros count. That's not great. Okay, so I've been spending a lot of time in the Ecto docs when I've been working on this. So let's see, Ecto adapter SQL. So we're actually dropping all the way down to Ecto adapter SQL. We can't really use the repo.insert or anything because that relies on having a schema or atom keys. Even when you're not doing schemas, usually they require atom keys. Trust me, I've explored this, the ecto space of this quite a bit. And also bothered the ecto mailing list a fair bit. They're very helpful. But they also said no to my needs. That's quite all right. So it's possible that we have rows here. I would like to inspect that. I can also return it, because right now nothing will essentially break from that. Save that. So let's put that on hold. And just see what we can get here. Entity. So what I would like to have here, I want to assert, it should have an ID. That's something. And then it should have the title, foo, and the body bar. Because it's pretty important to be able to pick up the which entity you just created when dealing with this kind of stuff. So let's see how that does. Mix test /ecto entity Sqlite. Empty list. Swell. Let's see if we have anything else to go on here. It's a long time since I actually need to care about sort of the return values of a SQL call. Command execute. So, okay. Ecto last inserted ID. I'm looking at some Elixir form right now. No, let's see. So this one doesn't really give us much to go on. I wonder if there's any options, log. No. So if I read it back inside the transaction, that would be one thing. Let's see, Sqlite insert latest new ID. So this might also be so I guess what we'll be looking at doing, because I think this is what you want by default, is we actually want that to be 1. So does ecto adapters query provide no. So I'm thinking about how to do a transaction properly here. Sqlite transaction. SQL transaction. So I hope SQL transactions are fairly uniform in syntax. I'm not sure they are though. Cross-platform SQL transaction. Is this a thing people do? Actually, the repo.transaction might still work perfectly fine, because I do have the repo. Let's see. I'm looking at Ecto repo docs. Sorry, I don't have them in the view right now. That's I know it's a little bit annoying, but there's a lot to deal with. I have limited screen space. So I was going to look for how to use it with dynamic Ecto SQL dynamic repos. Because when you're doing right, you've already put the dynamic repo, so should not be an issue. You should just need to do I will probably need this gets a little bit annoying. Let's see. So R equals either it's repo PID, or if that evolves to nil, then it's repo module. And this one wants the R. While I think repo module dot transaction is what we need to do. We want all of this in a transaction, which we do. And I also need to change set dynamic. Honestly, not sure I do need to change that. I could just do so this is either a PID or a module reference. That's the tricky part. But I could always pull, since we're in the store and we have the store, we could always do store.repo.module. Yep. So store.repo.module. That's a little bit gnarly, but it should be okay-ish. And if that works, so if this one matched there, should be able to do ecto.adapters.sql query. I should alias this though. Repo. So select last row last insert row ID. Is that valid for Postgres and friends as well? Insert with returning. Returning ID. So does SQLite have insert returning? And does MySQL have insert returning? Looking at docs. The MariaDB seems to have that. I don't know if MySQL does. Okay, so I should be able to do returning ID. Actually, I want to figure out. I might not need that. Pulling that out a little bit. So let's see if we can avoid needing to do that part. But I mean, I could assume ID. That's not correct, but let's start there. So equals R io.inspect R. Let's see what we get. Explosions. 106. Yeah. R. I'm gonna have to change so many tests. No such column ID. Insert into posts. Yeah, I think the column is called UID, just to be correct. But that's a decent sign. So actually, this adapter, let's see, let's look at our type. Rather, this is for the Sqlite test. If you have questions and thoughts and opinions, I'm happy to discuss further what I'm doing. And let's see. I accidentally ended up checking my email. That wasn't what I was aiming for. No, that wasn't it at all. So this is the Sqlite test, and it sets up a type somewhere. There, no, not there. Oh, right. This UID string. No, what's the correct type for that? I don't remember. So type. Okay, we use the word ID. And yeah. So let's do, we call them ID and we make them a string. Which means on insert, we should probably be generating that. There's a bunch of stuff Ecto can do for us with regard to generating a new ID, I think. But I haven't investigated that yet, so maybe we do it for now. Let's call it good enough that we do it. That's the one. So on insert. We should probably check that the type has ID, new ID for type. So that, here's the type definition. Let's pass that there, and then let's go implement that. New ID for type. So how do we figure out what's the primary key here? Well, you can't really change the primary key right now. So that's going to be fairly straightforward. There are a few ways we could do it. So actually, if we look at this, it also provides what sort of a convenience thing, which is fields, which is where we've collapsed all of the migrations into the end result. So we know, like, if we have archived fields, they're not in fields, or they're marked as archived. I don't remember. But that should be, that should allow us to see the primary in there somewhere. So there's a bunch of things for turning things into field. Migration set item to field. So yeah. So it has the persistence options, primary key true. And I think enum1 is a thing, right? Sometimes I'm gonna learn about Elixir. Yeah, let's assume we can find only one. That's only gonna be true for to do currently assumes single primary key. That's not an assumption that's necessarily going to hold forever, but it's going to hold for a bit. So key field opts, and then we go get in field opts, and then there's a key sequence we want to follow. So it's persistence options primary key. So that's either that's going to be true or it's going to be null. And if it's null, we can do false. So that should get us there. To find the primary key. Field name. Don't think we need options. Oh, yeah, arguably we do. And with those, we can just do case, field options, and then that should have a storage type we can work on. What was the storage type of these? It's UID. Or ID. So if it's ID, I don't have to do anything actually. And if it's UUID, I'm not sure if I have to do anything. This is the thing. I'm not sure if we're passing the right layers of Ecto or not, and how much our database is going to be doing for us. So actually, let's hold off on this and just see if it UID for type. Blah, 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 blah. So if we are creating a table with ID, and that's, try that. This is insert. So then let's see about this test. Columns, ID. The Sqlite result has columns, ID. Doesn't have any rows though, so it's nil right now, which is not great. So let's assume that for a UUID, we need to do the generating. So for columns, columns equals if new. Let's first go down here. If it's an ID, I don't think we need to do anything. And if it's a UID, we can use, how's that module? I don't remember which one I like most. Force, right? Or is it one that's actually the sort of... Yeah, let's do a U and 1. So now we have a new ID for a UID type, but we only want if new. So if it's a new ID, do else end. super awkward. Poor columns. This used to be pretty clear. I don't like it. Then we need to, I guess we can just as well prefix it, that's fine. Then we need to add ID to the columns. If we're adding ID to the columns, we also need to add an ID to the values. This is annoying. And this is why every time I've poked at the idea of building a CMS, I get very frustrated in the end because it's a lot of work and it's super finicky. There's so many details. Actually, I think we're heading towards when I should be wrapping up, but well, we can see if this gets us anywhere. Oh yeah, we should not be prefixing this just because that makes everything else more difficult. Probably. No, it doesn't matter. So that's just values, but if we have a new just equal, and this is value holders that we need to deal with. So we can do values and value holders. And that's returning them unchanged. And this is for, so we prefix the ID. This means that we need to prefix the value. So this goes here, and then the rest of them go after. I think that should be fine. But then we also need to build out our value holders. So this is to keep the parameterization of the whole thing. We should have. Oh, okay, I did that in that one. Okay, I guess I could have just counted as well. So value holders plus plus. There has to be such a significantly easier approach to this that I'm just not caring about right now. So if we count the values, it's like, well, so if we have 5 values, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the last one should say 5. Seems about right. Might be enough by 1. We'll see. All right, now some quoting. Values, value holders. This has been a journey. What new UID? I did something wrong. completely friends with Tmux for this thing yet. I'll get there eventually. One values for 3 columns. Oh, I never rejoined these values. Or did I? So this should actually be value holders that we join. Okay, so it did return things that we can use. Sweet. Let's hope it does it across all the SQL kinds. But I'm not gonna do that to it. So can I do just returning asterisk? Seems like it. And then I should be able to re-encode. So let's see, def list. I know we do some stuff here. Result to items. Result to items. Columns and rows. Yeah, that's it. I think we have the definition up here somewhere. We should. Yeah, we do. And we have the result. And then we have the items. And I expect this to be exactly one item. And I want to return that one. Let's see if that gets us there. Not quite. Function UID.type is undefined. Module UID is unavailable. Uh-huh. And that's happening in entity load. Entity. No, not that one. So that happens in there. Case loader. Yeah, so that is expected to be a function. String to existing atom. No, the loader part, and that's triggered in entity load. ectotype.adapter load. This loads the adapter, and there's no type adapter for a UID. I think we can just keep this simple for now, and instead of claiming to the database this is a UID, which I don't think is a type in SQLite, we can call it a string. And when we create the type, what's currently going on? Defaults. Actually, that's probably fine. All right, not sure how to proceed with this part. I could probably add a special rule that says, if this is UID, don't do the thing. Which I don't feel great about. So I'm not gonna hack through that right now. But yeah, this is the type of thing you get into if you want to do really, really dynamic schema handling and stuff in any database essentially. But Ecto sort of pushes you in this direction if you want to do what I'm doing. Which is not a slam on Ecto, because this is a very extreme use case. I think it can be done well, and we're trying to use as much as Ecto as possible. And I'm curious to see if people find this interesting, compelling. Needs a better demo, for sure. But that's for later. There's a lot of work to do still. All right, that'll be it for now. I need to head off. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out Untitled.io, especially the newsletter. That's really where I share all the fun stuff.